Module 4, Tobacco Legislation and Regulation. The next slide will be a short news clip from back in the 60s about the then Surgeon General's report regarding the harmfulness of tobacco, which pretty much sets the stage for the growing movement towards legislation and regulation of tobacco in this country.
Tonight's CBS Reports begins with this historic announcement by the Surgeon General of the United States on January 11, 1964.
It is a judgment of the committee that cigarette smoking contributes substantially to mortality from certain specific diseases and to the overall death rate.
That was 3 months ago. Today, the implications of this report to the nation's health and to its economy are just beginning to dawn.
In the rural area, if we lose our tobacco, we're going to be hurting pretty bad now, that's for sure. If it would be a gradual process, some can survive. If it comes all at once, I think we're all going to go down to drink.
At stake are the incomes of 750,000 families who farm the nation's 5th largest cash crop. The jobs of 96,000 men and women involved in tobacco manufacturing. The $8 billion a year tobacco industry, which pays more than $3 billion in federal, state, and local taxes, and $150 million worth of cigarette advertising, with the ethical and moral problems it poses for all media, especially television.
If a next-door neighbor came to you and said to your son or your daughter, smoke, it's a good thing. Here, try this. It'll make you seem like a man. You'd probably throw him out of the house on his ear. Well, equivalently persuasive advertising is doing something very, very similar.
Here now is CBS News correspondent Harry Reasoner.
This is the exhibit hall at the annual convention of the National Association of Tobacco Distributors, and some of the products being shown to these 6,000 wholesalers. Quite plainly, these men are not completely dependent on cigarettes. But equally plainly, anything that affects cigarette sales is big news to them. Last year, this country produced and distributed $8 billion worth of tobacco products. There are something like 1.5 million retail outlets for cigarettes, many of which tempt smokers with everything from pens to playing cards. This is the size of the economic edifice that would be threatened by any substantial and permanent change in American cigarette smoking habits.
Dr. Luther L. Terry, Surgeon General of the United States.
My advice to the smoker would be to stop cigarette smoking. My advice to the person who has not started smoking is don't start.
Tonight, we asked several questions. What has happened since the Surgeon General's report? Has there been, is there likely to be, any remedial action? And finally, what moral or ethical obligation does this pose to the United States government, the tobacco industry, the advertising agencies that promote the sale of cigarettes to the tune of $150 million a year, the newspaper, magazine, radio, and television stations and networks that carry this advertising, including the station and network you are now watching? The cigarette health controversy has caused a collision of interests on a grand scale. The forces of public health are attempting to change the smoking habits of 70 million Americans.
To the farmers of North Carolina, the Surgeon General's report represents one kind of threat. To the teenagers of Newton, Massachusetts, it represents another.
Now, in the light of the Surgeon General's report on smoking, the report of the Royal College of Physicians, and other similar reports, I consider it completely unnecessary to go into the medical evidence against cigarette smoking. I will give you one statistic only. If present trends in smoking continue, then 1 million present school children in the United States will die of lung cancer before they reach the age of 70 years.
Dr. Eva Salbert, Senior Research Associate at Harvard School of Public Health, recently completed a 4-year study of the smoking habits of 7,000 Newton junior and senior high school students. Recently, the South African-born physician led a discussion at Newton South High School.
I'm sort of inclined to believe that this report will die out, as a lot of the other Senate investigating committees and governmental reports. It has an impact in the beginning, and a lot of people say, oh, I'm going to die if I don't start smoking. I'm going to start smoking.
I know several people who, as soon as the report came out, decided to stop smoking right then and there. But I look at the report as maybe a spark that sets off the flame. I think that now is the time to do something about what you've been wanting to do all along. And I also feel, as Chuck does, that if this report isn't continually repeated and stressed, that it may die out and people will just forget about it.
Well, I don't think the report strikes close enough to home. I admit that it probably will discourage some smokers, but in general, I think that unless a person sees somebody who has been smoking for a long time and does develop a very bad cough or does eventually develop cancer, that I don't think it's going to do too much good.
You see the advertisements on television, and smoking just seems to be the thing to do. And you see the attractive couples, you see them sitting on a beach, and they instinctively light up a cigarette. I mean, this is the thing to do. You see them walking in the country, and they can't take a walk in the country without a cigarette. The cigarette is an essential part of the picture. It completes the picture.
The people smoking are always very attractive, very beautiful people, and the advertisements usually portray either a very romantic setting or in sports sort of a very virile image of man. And some advertisements have a man and a woman in a very romantic setting, and subconsciously you could think of yourself in this place.
Basically, they say, well, if you smoke this brand, you'll have a new girl, a new job, you'll make $50,000 a year, and you'll be a water skier. Now, that, I think, has a great effect on the younger people. But I think I was basically influenced by my parents and my sister in the home life.
My parents didn't make a great effort to stop me. They told me that it wasn't good for me. The only thing they didn't want me to do was smoke in public.
I feel it was more that my friends started smoking, and we did it to make ourselves appear older. When we were in junior high school, we looked up and saw the high school students smoking, and we wanted to associate ourselves with them. This, I think, is the main reason why I started, and it just became a habit that was hard to break, and I haven't as yet stopped.
Father Thomas Garrett is the author of many publications dealing with business ethics and is professor of philosophy at the University of Scranton.
Is it immoral for the media that carry cigarette advertising, newspapers, magazines, television, which is licensed in the public interest, is it immoral for them to carry these ads?
If the advertising were nothing but a simple picture of the package and the name of the product, I don't think we'd see any real moral problem. But when they stop, let us say, to urge the young to use cigarettes, we've got a problem. And notice, Mr. Reasoner, that in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a shift in cigarette advertising with the appeals directed to the young. Let's put it this way. The man who drives the getaway car in a bank robbery is as guilty as the man who goes inside and holds the gun on the teller. And when you're cooperating as a media owner or writer, you're involved in it too.
It's been suggested that the real cigarette test for this country is to find out whether something which is so good for us economically and apparently so bad for our health, whether this kind of an issue can be resolved in a democracy. Do you believe it can?
Well, I believe it can be resolved, but I wonder if it will be resolved. And I'll tell you why. I'm a little cynical, as I said before. I'm afraid that there will be a big brouhaha, smoke and fire, and the thing will die quietly off. And in between, I think the eyes of the public will have goof of dust scattered in them. May I give you an example of that? Last night, there was a commercial called for X cigarette, and it went something like this. We bring you an important message. X, no other cigarette, according to any survey, is better medically than X cigarette. This is not a claim. This is a fact. practically implied it was a public service. Now, if you analyze that, you'll see that that's pure, unadulterated, 100% goofy dust. It gives you the vague impression maybe there's something good about this, and it tries to say pooh-pooh to all these reports. And I'm afraid we're going to have a rash of this type of counter-propaganda.
Father Garrett, do you know advertising men who really believe that smoking is not harmful to health, but the case hasn't been proven?
Well, I don't know any of them, and after all, they don't allow illiterates on Madison Avenue.
Do you think that they see a moral situation?
I would say most of them do, but I'm a little cynical in that some of the most moral, shall we say, are those without cigarette accounts. And I think we have to face this.
Author of the recently published Confessions of an Advertising Man, the Scottish-born chairman of the board is David Ogilvy. He invented the man with the eye patch for Hathaway shirts, but he refuses to accept cigarette clients.
We've handled 2 cigarette accounts in our day, but that was before the Royal College of Physicians report. We read the Royal College of Physicians report when it first came out. It seemed to us the conclusions were inescapable. We decided then as a company that we would not want to accept any cigarette advertising. We would not want to handle it. And when the Surgeon General's report came out, we repeated that decision.
What do you think about American cigarette commercials?
Disgraceful. I watch these commercials. I see the handsome, athletic young man drawing in a mouthful of cigarette smoke and then inhaling it down into his lungs. And I'm appalled to think that I belong to the profession which can perpetrate that kind of villainy. I see other cigarette commercials which are written by what we call in our business weasel merchants, which are essays in the art of casuistry. They're intellectually dishonest. The men who wrote them and who paid for them know it.
Mr. Ogilvy, suppose you had to prepare an anti-smoking campaign. What are some of the techniques you might use?
We would show admirable people who do not smoke, people that the young would want to identify themselves with. We might show some of the people who are addicted cigarette smokers and what miserable, neurotic fellows they're apt to be. And I, for one, wouldn't hesitate to show the youth and all viewers, once again, what it's like when you have terminal lung cancer, what sort of a way it is to get out of this world.
Some ad spokesmen say whatever can be sold legally can be advertised legally. What do you think of this argument?
Perhaps this all comes down in the last to a matter of individual conscience. If there's an advertising man whose conscience is not troubled by advertising cigarettes, perhaps he can advertise them. If there's a network whose president's conscience is not troubled by taking money for his stockholders for running cigarette commercials, perhaps they can be run.
Senator Maureen Neuberger also testified.
I'm most concerned about the cynical attitude of the tobacco industry, that they don't want the Federal Trade Commission to issue any regulations that are going to interfere with the economy, as they call it, of the industry. Well, I admit everywhere that this is a big multi-billion-dollar industry in our country. But nevertheless, I think it's a pretty cynical attitude if we don't take a certain amount of consideration for the fact that the health and welfare of 190 million Americans is at stake.
We asked Father Garrett if he favored the FTC's proposal to label cigarettes as a health hazard.
What I'm afraid is, Mr. Reasoner, that this may be used as an excuse for doing nothing else. You know, we've been good boys, we've labeled them, the public is warned, and now let it drop. And human beings being what they are, it will drop. And people will go on just as they are, with the printing down there at the bottom of the pack and no continual reminder of what's really at stake.
Now the rise of tobacco regulation in the United States can be seen really in a sharp contrast to that of alcohol prohibition. That is, at the time, people wanted to remove alcohol because they felt that in doing so would vastly improve American society, whereas in regards to mounting evidence of the harmfulness of tobacco on people's health, there is still a lot of reluctance on many individuals, politicians, industry, and so forth, towards the regulation of tobacco. But overall, in terms of what we've been seeing in regards to tobacco in the United States, when the first report was first made in 1964, that was pretty much amongst the highest level of consumption of tobacco and cigarettes in the United States at that time. Since that first report, you saw, declines starting to occur, usually first in certain fits and jumps. It declined, it was slightly increased, and so forth. But since the 1970s, we saw a sharp decline in the number of tobacco and cigarette users in the United States. Again, the idea around banning tobacco was fought against numerous stakeholders, primarily among those who were in states with a large amount of industry around tobacco, mostly around some of the southern states. And so you had a number of stakeholders who are against the banning of tobacco, who had a lot of influence on the political process. You also saw a lot of popularity around the image of people smoking. The issue around smoking in popular culture, or the image people had regarding smoking, was very strong for many number of years, and it took many years to try to reverse that. And then there were other factors that come into play regarding people's right to smoke, the right to use tobacco, and so the effect of tobacco regulation legislation focused much more on creating numerous barriers to smoking as opposed to banning tobacco outright. And so you saw legislation banning smoking in certain areas. You saw the implementation of taxes, increasing taxes, for one, trying to get additional revenue, tax revenue, but at the same time, by increasing the cost of the product, people would see a decrease in use. Now, in terms of the history regarding tobacco regulation, in '64, that was the first Surgeon General's report. They were identifying the relationship between lung cancer and other cancers in men, the relationship between lung cancer and women, issues around bronchitis, again being directly related to cigarette smoking. From there, 65, you have the first attempt to try to regulate tobacco, primarily through requiring warning labels on packages of cigarettes, and also banning cigarette advertising in broadcast media, so they were unable to advertise on television or radio, which previously they were able to. Print media was still possible. And so this was really the first attempt at, again, trying to limit the impact of smoking on the American public. And then much later, in the 80s, you really start to see more effective kinds of legislation. That is, the banning of smoking within certain areas. The first group to try to promote smoke-free areas were flight attendants, who felt that working within a closed area in the plane with a number of smokers constantly was leading to numerous health problems. And so through their activity, through their leadership, they're able to work and to have the federal banning of smoking on domestic flights of 6 hours or less. And this really was the first attempt to to legislate to prevent individuals within a certain context to actually smoke. And this then led to other legislation or also other policies by a number of other by workplaces in general to prevent smoking within work areas. Now, since then, there has been a number of other research findings, again, showing the relationship between tobacco and cigarette smoking with many other health problems. At the same time, there have been studies showing the positive effect anti-smoking laws have had. Example being this one in Minnesota. The implementation of a smoke-free restaurant ordinance within a county found a decrease in the number of people, or a decrease in the incidence of sudden cardiac death within the population, and also the decrease in the number of people actually smoking as well. So, showing a definite positive health outcome by banning smoking within just this one social area. It's not to say that other areas may have implemented bans of their own within workplaces and so forth, but the further movement towards the limitation of where people can smoke has had a positive impact in regards to reducing the incidence of health problems. And you see, again, additional research showing the negative relationship between tobacco and health and the growing positive effect these anti-smoking laws were making on positive health outcomes within society. However, you're still seeing a lot of reluctance by people in the tobacco industry and by others who support the tobacco industry in accepting this evidence. And the next slide will show a snippet from a House panel meeting discussing this relationship between tobacco and health, and how you have a number of CEOs and people within the tobacco industry showing doubt or regarding the evidence of showing the evidence of tobacco and its effect on health.
Well, I want you to know that I and all my colleagues on this subcommittee appreciate your being here. Your participation in the subcommittee's ongoing investigation into tobacco is essential. This is not going to be, however, an easy day. We have a lot of substantive issues that we want to go into. When we hear about scientific disputes, we have to listen to one expert versus another. But let me tell you, there's some things that we know about from our own personal experience. I was a smoker, and I know how addicted I was to smoking. I know how hard it was to quit. Each and every time I did try to quit. And I had to do it a number of times before I was successful. So from my own personal experience, and from people I've known and talked to, your universal comment that cigarette smoking is not addictive just doesn't ring true. Now, Mr. Johnson, I want to start with your testimony. You and your colleagues seem to have almost a fanatical insistence that your product's the same as all these other products. This morning in your written statement and your oral statement, you compared cigarettes to coffee, tea, sweets, sugar, warm milk, cheese, chocolate, and Twinkies. That's quite a list. I'm struck by what I think is a calculated attempt to trivialize the devastating health impacts of your product. You and I both know that Twinkies don't kill a single American a year. They may not add to a healthy diet, but they don't kill. The difference between cigarettes and Twinkies and the other products you mentioned is death. I'm sure you're aware that the Surgeon General and the American Medical Association estimate that cigarettes kill over 400,000 smokers every year. Putting aside your assertion that people accept this risk willingly, do you agree with this estimate?
Do I agree with the estimate of 435,000 people? I've heard from this committee this morning three or four different numbers. My understanding of how that number is
If you don't agree with the number, then give us your number. How many smokers die each year from smoking cigarettes?
I will explain.
No, I want your answer. We have a limited time.
I do not know how many.
Do you disagree with the Surgeon General's opinion?
It is a computer-generated number that makes
Mr. Johnson, I'm going to have to ask you to respond to my questions. Do you or do you not agree with the Surgeon General's estimate of over 400,000 smokers dying each year?
I do not agree.
Okay. Do you know how many die each year?
I do not know.
How can you, as the chief executive officer of a company manufacturing a product that's been accused of killing so many people, not know this information? How is it?
I'm telling you that number is generated by a computer, and it makes two important assumptions. The first, that virtually everyone who smokes and dies because they smoked unless they got run over by a bus. And second, that model allows people to die 1, 2, 3, 4 times. I don't know how that can happen, but that's what that model does.
Well, I'm struck by the overwhelming scientific agreement on the dangers of smoking. The U.S. Public Health Service, the Surgeon General, the Food and Drug Administration, the World Health Organization, the National Cancer Institute, the American Medical Association. I guess all of these groups you would call the anti-tobacco industry. But they all say it's hazardous. The experts also agree that smoking causes heart disease. Do you agree that smoking causes heart disease?
It may.
Okay. They agree that smoking causes lung cancer. Do you agree?
It may.
Do you know whether it does?
I do not know.
Why not?
Because all of that is
proprietary?
Statistically generated data. It is epidemiological as opposed to empirical. There have been no laboratory studies which have been able to confirm any statistics.
Our colleague John Bryant said in his opening statement his grandfather, who smoked all of his life, died of lung cancer. Do you think that lung cancer was caused by smoking?
I don't know, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. The medical experts agree that smoking causes emphysema. Do you agree? Emphysema.
It may.
They agree that smoking causes bladder cancer, stroke, and low birth weight. Do you agree?
It may.
Mr. Tisch, I want to move to you for a moment. In a deposition last year, you were asked whether cigarette smoking causes cancer. Your answer was, quote, "I don't believe so." Do you stand by that answer today?
I do, sir.
Do you understand how isolated you are in that belief from the entire scientific community?
I do, sir.
You're the head of a manufacturer of a product that's been accused by the overwhelming scientific community to cause cancer. You don't know? Do you have an interest in finding out?
I do, sir. Yes.
And what have you done to pursue that interest?
Well, we have looked at the data, and the data that we have been able to see has all been statistical data that has not convinced me that smoking causes death.
Mr. Campbell, you were also deposed, and you said, quote, "To my knowledge, it has not been proven that cigarette smoking causes cancer." This is a rather passive and puzzling approach, especially in light of the consensus, not by some, but all of the scientific community. Will you ever be convinced, and what evidence are you waiting for? And let's have the microphone passed over.
Yes, I may be convinced. We don't know what causes cancer in general right now, so I think that we may find out what causes cancer, and we may find out some relationship which has yet to be proven.
Well, you know, I must say this is rather a passive approach. Don't you feel you have an obligation, the same obligation that every other consumer company has, to determine whether you're causing harm and to take steps to minimize that harm? You're not meeting that responsibility, and it's clear your views on the health impacts of cigarettes are out of step with an overwhelming scientific evidence. If all the medical people who don't work for you say it causes cancer, what more do you need to understand that that's the case and to accept it and then try to work constructively to try to see if we can avoid that terrible tragedy to so many people?
Is there a question, sir?
That's a question.
I'm sorry, it was too long for me to...
Well, I think that the point I'm making is that all of you have some responsibility not simply to say you don't know, even when the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence is against you. I think you have an obligation to know. In my view, at the center of the entire debate over tobacco is nicotine. This ingredient in tobacco has an enormous impact on humans. At our last hearing, Mr. Spears told the subcommittee that nicotine is an important flavor. In contrast, Dr. Kessler said the taste of nicotine is actually bitter and can be replicated through the addition of pepper. Dr. Kessler also told the subcommittee that he was unaware of any purpose for the inclusion of nicotine in a tobacco product except for its addictive effect. Yet Mr. Spears insisted to the subcommittee that nicotine was a flavor. I want to insert in the record at this point a document titled Tobacco Flavoring for Smoking Products. The document was published by the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company in 1972. The document lists hundreds of potential flavorings for tobacco and rates them for smoke taste and smoke aroma. But neither nicotine nor nicotine sulfate is listed as an additive. Am I missing something, Mr. Johnson? This was R.J. Reynolds. Why wasn't nicotine listed as a tobacco flavoring? Or do you disagree?
I would want to see the document, but I think I can give you the general answer to that. Nicotine is the natural component of tobacco leaf, and therefore would not be an added ingredient. Nicotine sulfate, as everyone here has testified, is required by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in minuscule quantities.
So
that was a
document. It's not a flavor because it wasn't added?
That was a document, as I recall it, that addresses flavors and aromas.
So you submit then that it's not listed as a flavor in your document, company's document, because it's a natural ingredient in the tobacco?
I would have to look at that document, understand what its purpose and intent is. I'm trying to give you a generalized answer to a publication 22 years old.
Okay. Well, we're going to move on and we'll get back to some of these issues. Mr. Baldwin?
Now, because the federal government were very reluctant to pass additional regulation regarding tobacco, any other changes were becoming very slow. The number of states took a different route. That is, they sued tobacco companies directly in order to recoup the medical costs of the residents who are suffering from tobacco-related diseases or disease-related that are associated with tobacco use. Okay, the tobacco companies, not really wanting this to go to court, agreed on a settlement in around 97-98, providing $206 billion to 46 states over 25 years. As a result, the industry agreed to additional restrictions on advertising. Much of this money went to to the American Legacy Foundation to help promote anti-smoking programming, public service announcements, and so forth. If you recall, the Truth Campaign was funded from money from this master settlement. And much of this money was supposed to go to states to help fund tobacco education, tobacco programming. However, many states use very little of the settlement money for this kind of tobacco control activity. And then nothing happens again until 2009. And this is with the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. Okay, this is where the only attempt to try to produce additional regulation on tobacco and smoking in the United States. And through this law, the primary activity is to have tobacco to be regulated by the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. Prior to this, tobacco was an unregulated product, even though it was being consumed by individuals. Any kind of food product, junk food, Cheetos, corn chips, um, baked goods, anything anybody consumes, alcohol, and then prescription drugs had to meet certain FDA requirements. Except prior to 2009, tobacco didn't have to do anything with it. So in 2009, that changed things, so that now tobacco has to be regulated by the FDA, and so the FDA kind of will have to can say what can go into a tobacco product, what things can be added, what kind of things need to be are necessary. There's create additional regulation regarding who and how tobacco can be sold, who can it be sold to, and so forth. Presented the mandated proof of age to purchase tobacco, required face-to-face sales, banning the sale of packages of fewer than 20 cigarettes, so banning the sale of individual cigarettes. And so really starting to limit people's access, or limit the ways in which people can access and purchase cigarettes. Much of this required mostly to prevent the access by young people who are not likely to perhaps be able to afford to purchase a whole pack of cigarettes, but maybe could afford a single cigarette. So by banning the sale of individual cigarettes, you're limiting young people's access to tobacco products. Again, much of the regulation, again, designed to try to limit the attractiveness of smoking by young people, and so they limited the design, the packaging of cigarettes to make it more unappealing to young people. This allowed tobacco industry to sponsor sporting or entertainment events under their name. They banned free samples of cigarettes or other items, banning the use of little tchotchkes with cigarette logos on them. Again, trying to limit the social appeal of tobacco and cigarettes within our society. Now, prior to this act, cigarette companies utilized a terminology, reduced harm cigarettes, light, low, or mild, as a way of showing how much better the cigarettes are compared to other cigarettes. However, with this new legislation, this required these companies to provide research showing that their product has lower amounts of harm or shows lower impact. And so they can't just say they're better, they have to show the evidence. And so there's much more research and evidence gathering as part of the FDA process. And then they had additional regulation regarding the packaging and advertisements for tobacco products. The warning labels have to be more prominent. You have to have more specific health warnings, and that has to be displayed by much more prominently. And then also including graphic designs of more graphic natures of the impacts of smoking on people's health. And lastly, some of the other things that are required. They have to be inspected and they have to register with the FDA every 2 years. A big significant thing, again, primarily to limit the access and the interest of young people. They banned cigarettes and other tobacco products with any kind of flavoring, except for menthol and tobacco flavored. The inclusion or the allowance of menthol has been very controversial because of the fact that this product, menthol cigarettes, has been shown to be used most predominantly by communities of color within African American population, and that's showing a large um, health impact from tobacco from the use of these menthol cigarettes. However, because this was shown to be a very lucrative part of their tobacco industry, there was much reluctance for them to have this kind of cigarette banned, and so they made that allowance, even though there's still strong evidence that it should have been included. And again, any manufacturer wishing to market a new tobacco product, again, they have to go and provide material to the FDA to provide the evidence and prior to the marketing of that new product. And so the FDA in the United States now has much growing influence on tobacco products in the United States. However, tobacco products are still legal for adults to use, still to a certain extent able to access its use. And if you're looking at the health statistics, cigarette use among young people has been declining, but there's still a sizable number of people still using. Whether or not, in regards to future regulation regarding tobacco, we'll have to see what's being discussed. Currently, there's not a whole lot being discussed for further regulation. Again, perhaps the fact that people are very reluctant to totally prohibit access to a formerly legal product, perhaps based on people's thoughts and perception of what happened with alcohol prohibition. But what's interesting in the next set of lectures, when we start looking at substances which have been and are still illegal in this country, and versus that of alcohol and tobacco, whereas you can make arguments in regards to harm in terms of use for either, but the relationship and the experiences of both have been very different.